cardiovascular system, do you guys have any questions?
Sorry, the movement for, which is I know it goes up behind your back.
Uh-huh.
It's confusing me, so I just remember what my last name was.
Yeah. So this is, so raising your hand is shoulder flexion, so the opposite motion would be extension.
Okay.
So extension, adduction, because you're going towards the body, and internal rotation, because you're going like this. Yeah. So you give me one of the actions, but I don't need both actions. One should be one. Yeah, some of this stuff is arbitrary, so like why did we decide that this is shoulder flexion? Right, that's kind of like, you know, this one makes obvious sense, like you can see why this is elbow flexion, right? The joint is getting shorter in range. This was pretty obvious why that's knee flexion, but shoulder and hip, it's kind of arbitrary, like why is this flexion? That's hip extension, why is this shoulder flexion? So when I was in anatomy, kinetic anatomy in grad school, my professor said, if you have a question, shoulder flexion. And that always kind of always stuck with me, yeah. So if this is shoulder flexion, the opposite action must be shoulder extension. So a lot of this stuff is arbitrary. So that's one of the things that really frustrates like some of the other hard sciences about biology. So like so chemistry, physics, right? It's always the same, right? So, you know, an object with X amount of mass and X amount of velocity is always going to have the same momentum. It doesn't ever change. But things are weird and arbitrary in biology all the time. So
Or it can bend too, right?
so the hamstring is hip extension and knee flexion. It does
Not
both.
at the same time as
It can do both technically at the same time, but it's going to be the prime mover for one or the other, right? So so a lot of people end up with hamstring injuries, right? So hamstring injuries are oftentimes caused by the fact that people have got weak gluteal muscles, right? So because they got weak gluteal muscles, the hamstring tries to do both actions, and it's kind of being pulled in both directions at the same time. That's what leads to a lot of hamstring injuries that we have. A lot of people have just like shortened range of motion. So we used to think that like doing exercise at the end range of motion was bad for you, but the data has actually shown that if you put a load on a stretched muscle, it actually is better for the muscle, right? So this is where doing exercise, you know, safely at the end range of motion. So for example, like taking a barbell, I can't bend very far today. I had a procedure done today. So like if you had a barbell and you went like this and you loaded your hamstrings while you stretched all the way down, that actually will increase what's called the functional range of motion, so you end up having less tears.
So that would be if you're not bending the knee.
Correct.
So it doesn't
That's an RDL, yeah. So if you did an RDL, so if you're on like a box and you did an RDL beyond below the box, like you can actually increase like your functional range of motion. So which leads to there's a lot of things wrong with our culture from a health standpoint. That's one of the many examples of it. So so if you go to Asia, right, you don't find hardly, you know, so hip replacement surgery is just not a thing in most of Asia, right? You go to a Japanese house, right? People sit on the floor, right? If you get invited to dinner at a Japanese house, you're gonna sit on a pillow on the floor, right? The table's gonna be like on the floor, right? Everybody sits all the time, right? Or you go to a train station, you're waiting for the train, you'll see people doing can you do the Asian squat?
I used to.
Not anymore?
It hurts my knee.
Yeah, nurses do that, yeah. So you'll see like people just kind of just pop a squat and they're just chilling, waiting for the train to show up, right? So, you know, Asian culture, it's from the floor up, right? Everything's from the floor up, right? You go to a restaurant, right? You go to a bathroom, right? You squat down, right? So they've got a lot more range of like, a lot more flexibility in their hips, knees, and ankles than we do, because we sit like this all day long and we end up with like decreased ranges of motion. Yeah. You don't see old people in Japan, China, Okinawa, Korea, you know, with hip problems and ankle and knee problems like we have. find a lot of people, like you go to Okinawa, it's like the Hawaii of Japan. You find 90-year-old people don't even have a cane, right? They just walk around, squat all the time and do gardening and all that, so you find that in Japan too. So. Although Tokyo's starting to get a little too westernized for some people's tastes. So. I heard they finally got rid of the creepy vending machines.
Like with,
Huh?
with what, like?
With like used women's clothing and stuff like
Oh,
that.
I've never seen that.
Yeah.
That must be like in the back alley.
That was back in the day, yeah, so,
They have alcohol still.
yeah.
Alcohol vending machines?
Oh, yeah.
Well, you need a pass now, but.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everything's automated, I mean, they're like literally living in the next century, Tokyo, yeah. So much more advanced than we are. So. Clean too. I always wanna go to there, Tokyo or Singapore, I wanna go both, so. But,
Isn't it just a cultural thing, you just like to be there, shared space?
Sure, yeah, like, at the World Cup, when Japan was in the World Cup, they showed like highlights of them after the game, cleaning up their section. You go to a movie theater, or like a game there, they don't have a cleaning crew, like people clean it up themselves.
There's no public trash can.
Yeah, yeah, so being messy is very cultural. I think the thing I find most fascinating about Japanese culture is, like, they're polite to like an extreme level, but you also know that they don't want you there, while being extremely polite about the fact that they don't want you there. Yeah. Like they don't like foreigners, but they're incredibly polite to people. It's so weird. They're a weird culture. They really are. Any other questions on muscles, guys? No? Okay. All right, so today we're gonna start moving on to the nervous system. So we're gonna do kind of one chapter all about just the general nervous system, and then we're gonna do a specific chapter, or we're gonna do something specifically about the brain. As you maybe remember, we talked about it when we talked about the muscular system, where this whole module is about what we call excitable tissue, meaning that it is able to react to a nerve or an action potential. That includes the nervous system, which is where those action potentials are generated, right? So it's like an electrical charge that's going on. The functional unit of all of our nervous system, from our brain, spinal cord, nerves, all that, are neurons. Neurons are cells, right? And they are able to transmit nerve impulses, but they only go in one direction, right? Which makes it good because we don't want things to get confused. Like all cells, right? They've got a cell body, and then they have these specialized kind of tendrils that come out of them called axons and dendrites. Information will always go in one direction. It will come in through the dendrites, which means tree, and then it'll go out through the axons. So it's always in through the axons, out through the in through the dendrites, out through the axons. So in through the dendrites, out through the axons. Always goes in one direction. You've got thousands of like nerve fibers, right? So we've got all these nerves. You guys will learn a little bit about them. You'll learn a lot about them when you go into the gross anatomy. They're just bundles of neurons and nerve fiber together. And then there's also what we call neuroglia, which literally means nerve glue. So the function of the neuroglia is basically, it's kind of the support network for our nervous system. It does all sorts of different things. When you guys think of the nervous system, what are some of the things you guys think of when you think of your nervous system?
The brain.
Our brain. So how does our nervous system help us maintain homeostasis? Send signals. What else?
It senses environment.
Yeah. So primarily there are three basic functions of our nervous system, right? So we have sensation, integration, and response. Really helpful. Okay. So sensation, integration, and response. Right? So we have two types of sensory information, right? So we have internal and external sensory information. Right now, right, you can see me, you can hear me, you can feel the environment around you. All of that would be external sensory information coming in. And then there's also internal sensory information that we're right now, none of you guys can tell me if your, you know, blood calcium levels was high or low, right? You generally don't know, same thing with blood sugar, right? You generally only know that if like, it's like on the extreme ends of the range, like your blood sugar is really low, your blood sugar is really high, and you're like, I feel good, okay? So all of that sensory information goes from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. Inside the peripheral nervous, or the central nervous system, that information is integrated, right? So it's taken in, a decision is made, and then a motor response is sent back out. So good easy example of that would be you touch a hot stove, right? What's happening? Sense what kind of sensory information is going up your arm to your central nervous system. I'm burning my hand, right? So that information gets to the central nervous system. Central nervous system processes it, okay? Damage is happening to the body. That's not good. So it does what? Sends out a motor response. What's the motor response to do? Take your hand off the burning stove, right? So that would be a good classic example of the three functions or phases of our nervous system, right? And all of that is due to neurons, bundles of neurons and neuroglia coming together to make nerves, which send a combination of either sensory, integrative, or motor functions. Okay. So motor means response. Did you have a question? No. Okay. So here we see a nice diagram that kind of breaks all of this down. Okay. We've got our central nervous system. There are basically two components to our central nervous system: the brain and the spinal cord. Okay. So all sensory information comes in to the spinal cord, and then some of it goes to the brain, some of it doesn't. Most of it goes to the brain. Okay. So we got the central nervous system, and then we got the peripheral nervous system, which would be, right, so like your facial nerve, your vagus nerve, the nerve endings in your fingers and toes, and all of that kind of stuff like that. There are two branches of the CNS, the afferent and efferent. Okay? So this is a good term for you guys to remember. Affect causes effect. Affect is what happens to you, effect is how you respond to it. Right? So affect, my hand is burning. Effect, I take my hand off the thing that's causing my fingers to burn. Okay? So afferent is incoming, efferent is outgoing. Okay? So afferent has two branches, the sensory and the visceral. Sensory are those, yes?
You said affect causes effect, and then you said affect is what happens to you, and
Effect is what you do in response to it. Right? So affect, I'm touching something that's burning me. Effect, I pull my hand off. So our afferent is our sensor, or is incoming and sensory information. So sensory stimuli would be the five senses, right? So those are the things you guys are constantly aware of: sight, taste, touch, smell, pain, pressure, motion, all of that. Visceral would be the stuff you're not consciously aware of, like your blood sugar levels, your blood calcium levels, how much neurotransmitter you're making, right? You're generally not consciously aware of that unless things get right. So like you start producing way too much dopamine, right? You become, you go into a manic phase, right? Or, right, you're producing so little, you become so depressed, like you can't even get out of bed. Most of the time, you can't notice what's going on there. Okay? And then our efferent, that's the outgoing. This is our motor response. We got two branches, the somatic and the autonomic. Somatic, like we talked about when we talked about muscular system, is your skeletal muscle. That's the only part of your body that you're consciously controlling. Okay? The rest is the autonomic, which was all of your glands, organs, tissues, all of that. It's got two branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. We're going to talk about this in greater detail, but this is the fight or flight system, and this is the rest and digest system. So this is going to control all of those smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, and different organs, so like your stomach, your spleen, your pancreas, all of that kind of stuff like that. So all the stuff that's coming in, the only thing we consciously control is this, the rest is all autonomic, which is good, because otherwise we'd be in really big trouble, right? We would have to like constantly think about, even when we were asleep, like, okay, make sure your heart, make sure you contract, right? That would be bad, right? We wouldn't ever be able to be unconscious. Okay? Make sense so far? Cool, okay. So here is a picture of a neuron. This is with a light microscope, so you guys could actually see this with the microscopes if you guys want to do that. Here you see the dendrites. So dendra is Greek for tree, right? So it looks like tree branches, or for branches. You have the cell body, and then you have the axon. So remember, sensory information always goes in through the dendrites, out through the axons. That whether it's sensory, integrative, or motor, it always goes in one direction, from dendrite to axon. Okay? And then we got the cell body, and then we got the neuroglial cells. You're gonna find all of the stuff that you find in any cell, it's just been modified and specialized, much like the muscular system. And because it's specialized, we give it the prefix neuro, right? So like, for example, we talked about the sarcolemma, that's the cell membrane of the muscle cell. On the nerve cell, we call it the neurolemma. It's just the cell membrane. It's just got some slight tweaks to it because it's, again, serving a specialized function, right? So we give it